when I was a little girl, my father always told me, learn things by heart.
Mm.
And in prison, he would repeat poems, he would read. It is not shown in the film, but it's in the interview. He received one small piece of paper, of a
Mm.
newspaper, that he would read hundreds and hundreds of times, like Natan Sharansky. And
Mhm.
I think that people who had this oceanic culture, encyclopedic culture and
Mhm.
knowledge, were better equipped to go through the hell of psychiatric confinement
Mhm.
and forced psychiatric treatment for political purposes. So I think it was about irony, about culture. And again, I'm coming back to this something about his Jewish experience. There was something very, very Jewish in his resistance.
I've long been interested in the fate of Soviet dissidents. I first went to the Soviet Union when I was already 13 or 14 on a school trip. And then I went again as an undergraduate student while I was at Oxford in the last days of Soviet communism. And at the time, a lot of my fellow students and even some of my teachers were more interested in attacking America and Britain and the West. But I, maybe because of that initial first trip, was very anti-communist and sympathetic to the anti-communist Soviet dissidents. So I helped smuggle things in and out of Moscow and Leningrad, which was the name for St. Petersburg at the time, on behalf of those dissidents, political appeals, reading materials I brought in for them, tape recordings about what they'd suffered, I brought out to give to people in the West and so on. And I also did the same for Czech dissidents in Prague a few months before the 1989 Velvet Revolution. Friends of Václav Havel, who were in exile in London, who I had come into touch with through my family, had asked me to bring things to Havel and other dissidents, so I did. So I was very happy to hear that a new documentary film has just been made about one of the dissidents I admired greatly, Victor Fainberg. So the film, which is called Madly in Descent, will be released later this year. But I've already been shown an advanced screening of it, and also I've watched it, in fact, twice. And I thought it would be a very nice idea to record a conversation with the film's Russian director, who now lives in exile in Tbilisi in Georgia, but is currently in Israel, visiting Victor Fainberg's daughter, Sarah, who lives in Israel. So I'm going to do a conversation with these two remarkable women. Before we get to the interview, just going to fill in a little bit of background in case people don't know. So in August 21st, 1968, the Warsaw Pact, the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, together invaded Czechoslovakia. Troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, also a few East Germans, though because of the Nazi past, they didn't send too many Germans for this invasion. They invaded Czechoslovakia to stop the pro-democracy reforms being carried out, which was known as the Prague Spring. And the military intervention was presented as brotherly help to the people of Czechoslovakia in their fight against counter-revolutionary forces, i.e. democracy. And the official media in Moscow announced that the Soviet people have been consulted and they unanimously approved this military intervention. Of course, that wasn't the case, but it was incredibly difficult and dangerous for anyone to protest. 4 days later, 8 brave people managed to travel to central Moscow, and they demonstrated right outside the Kremlin in Red Square against this invasion. They wrote handwritten pieces of cardboard or paper. They wrote slogans such as "For your freedom and ours." They were immediately beaten up by KGB plainclothes thugs. Some were sent to penal colonies in Siberia, but others faced what one is often described as even worse punishment. They were looked up by the KGB in psychiatric prisons, where they are subjected to terrible abuse, injected with all kinds of substances and so on. And they were mingled in and held with genuinely crazy people, even of course they weren't crazy at all. So one of the most prominent such people was the Jewish dissident Victor Fainberg, who unfortunately died earlier this month, January 2023, and he is the subject of the new film. I'm here today with the Russian filmmaker Ksenia Sakhanova and Sarah Fainberg, who is the daughter of the subject of Ksenia's new film, Victor Fainberg, the Soviet dissident. I have to say that in the film, Sarah is interviewed, and she says in the film that not enough people in Russia know about what happened to her father and other dissidents. He was taken to a psychiatric hospital and kept there for more than 4 years for doing nothing wrong. But in fact, not enough people in the West. You know, I'm from London. I also lived in America. Unfortunately, very few people in Western Europe and the United States also know about it. So, Ksenia, your film is very, very important. It was premiered last week in Tel Aviv because that's where Victor, who unfortunately died earlier this month, is buried in Israel. Ksenia, what gave you the idea to make a film about Victor? And in fact, how did you meet Sarah in the first place?
More than 10 years ago, me and my husband, Cyril, we made our first documentary, which is called 5 Minutes of Freedom. And that documentary told about the famous Red Square protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the protest which were held on August 25, 1968. And Victor Fainberg was among the protesters. And that's how we met him. And we went to Paris to make an interview with him because we couldn't invite him to Moscow. And we spent with Victor about 4 days in Paris. We were filming him and drinking wine, French wine. And we made a great interview. Only a little part of this interview we put in our film 5 Minutes of Freedom. And when I met Sarah, when Sarah came to Moscow 5 years ago, on the 50th anniversary of Red Square protest, we were together on the memory action at the Red Square. And then Sarah asked me if we can make a documentary about her father. And I say, yes, of course. Let's do it.
And that it's really, I really would recommend it. I've now watched it twice and I enjoyed it. I don't know if enjoy is the right word because it's about a very tragic situation, really. But I think it's it's a good film, but also a very important film. Just to fill people in, because they may not know, of course, in 1968, the Soviet Union and other communist countries invaded Czechoslovakia because the Czechs and Slovaks were showing signs of wanting to be more democratic, the so-called Prague Spring. And only 7 brave people, including Victor Fainberg, all they did was go to the walls of the Kremlin, to Red Square, and hold up handwritten placards or signs saying for your freedom and ours. And Victor was imprisoned for this 5 minutes of freedom for more than 5.5 years, 4 years of which were in a psychiatric hospital in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, as it is now. I'm not going to say any more because people should see the film when it comes out. But Sarah, I wanted to ask you, your father, he seems so jovial. He has a happy disposition about him in the film, like he looks on the bright side of life. Was that who he is? I mean, how did he manage to do that? He was in exile. He couldn't see your older brother, your half brother, who had to stay behind, a child in Russia, when, because after they let him out of prison, he moved to Israel. He was exiled, and later to France. So how did your father keep his spirits up?
You know, Tom, my father was born in Kharkiv in Ukraine in 1931 into a Jewish Soviet family. And very early on, he experienced a very violent anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union and when his family was evacuated during World War II. And I think that this first experience of exposure to extreme psychological and physical anti-Semitic violence strengthened his character and transformed him into a soldier, a combating soldier for his dignity as a Jew, and later on for the dissident movement. And there is something that is built in, there was something that was built in his personality that was very combative. And in order to combat, you need to have this degree of optimism.
Mm-hmm.
You need to look at history in a spiritual way, not how history is, but what history could become. And I think that my father and probably the other demonstrators were looking at Soviet history, what was going on, through the lens of what could be, what could this country become. And I think I will speak as his daughter. I think there is something very Jewish about it, about this deep-seated faith in a greater good. And I saw my father crying a lot when I was a little girl about his former, about the inmates, about his comrades who didn't make it, who were still imprisoned. But I saw a person who was deeply optimistic, deeply combative. And this is the DNA of his personality.
Also very brave. I mean, he had his at least 4 teeth knocked out in that initial 5 minutes of freedom. The KGB plainclothes police knocked out his teeth, and then I think it was the other dissident, Bukowski, who said that to be locked up in a psychiatric hospital was a worse state than going to the Gulag or to Siberia. I mean, it must have been hell what he survived. And again, I'm very sorry to say that I've been telling lots of people about your film in the last week since I saw it. And my friends are educated people from various different countries and backgrounds, and almost none of them have any idea that the Soviets put people in psychiatric hospitals. And I said, it could still be going on, maybe in Belarus, maybe in North Korea, that we don't know about. It's a real crime, and we should know about it. And that's why I think this film is so important. But also, I think with your father, maybe having a kind of, not exactly a sense of humor, but a humorous disposition, it might have disarmed his jailers. He was playing a kind of mind game of cat and mouse with him, it seems, from the film, and we have actors in the film act out some of the scenes and so on. Is that possible? I don't know.
Yes, my father was an intellectual, and I think that one of the main characteristics of an intellectual is to see the life through irony. And I think that his ironic posture may help him in prison. He was always looking at this, not through a first dimension, but through a second historical, and I would say spiritual dimension. And I think that, when I was a little girl, my father always told me, learn things by heart. And in prison, he would repeat, poems he would read. I mean, it is not shown in the film, but it's in the interview. He received one small piece of paper, of a newspaper, that he would read hundreds and hundreds of times, like Natan Sharansky. And I think that people who had this oceanic culture, you know, encyclopedic culture and knowledge, were better equipped to go through the hell of psychiatric confinement and forced psychiatric treatment for political purposes. So I think it was about irony, about culture. And again, I'm coming back to this, something about his Jewish experience. There was something very, very Jewish in his resistance and combativity. Some people may disagree. This is my own perspective as his daughter.
No, I think so. I mean, obviously not all Jews are like that, but certainly there are quite a lot of Jewish human rights defenders in Russia and indeed in other countries in the world too. And we mention in the film Elena Bonner, Sakharov's wife. I think she was Jewish, and also Vladimir Friedman, who helped smuggle out some of the appeals of your father to Sakharov and then to the West. So I also wanted to mention that I know that your father lived for 5 years in London, where he campaigned for other Soviet dissidents and also against the abuse of psychiatry. And he came to the attention then of very prominent people like the playwright, the Czech-born playwright Tom Stoppard, who dedicated his play, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. He dedicated it to Vladimir Bukovsky and your father, Victor Fainberg. Did your father meet Tom Stoppard, or he saw the play?
Yes, my father met with Tom Stoppard. My father was very active in London at the request of Andrei Sakharov. He's the man who asked him explicitly to lead the campaign against psychiatric abuses in the former Soviet Union in London. That was at the time the most active European capital working on behalf of political prisoners in the former Soviet Union. So this is how my father met Tom Stoppard, but also other activists like Max Gammond or the poet Richard McCain. And he became very involved in this literary and political milieu that was actively fighting for the liberation of political prisoners from the former Soviet Union, and was actually very successful at it.
And Celia, I think you told me that you met Tom Stoppard in Moscow and wanted to try to put on his play there.
Yes, that was our idea, because Tom Stoppard was also a member of CAPA, campaign against the uses of psychiatry in political purposes in London.
That was established by my father.
Yes, he was a member. And we saw the movie where young Stoppard is with Victor on some demonstration in London. And we met Tom Stoppard in Moscow 3 years ago, before the pandemic started. And we discussed the possibility to make this play, to stage this play in Moscow.
And hopefully it will be staged in future there in Moscow.
Not now, not during Putin's time.
But in the future,
One day.
One thing on a sadder note, one of the most shocking things in your film, if I remember the name, it was that I think his name was Dennis Lee from America.
Yes.
He was the Secretary General of the International Committee of Psychiatrists. And let me get this right. Your father smuggled out information through Vladimir Friedman and Andrei Sakharov to this Dr. Lee, and then Dr. Lee, instead of campaigning, sent it back to the Soviet authorities, and as a result, they they sentenced Bukowski to 12 years in prison or hard labor. Is that, I mean, that's a terrible, shocking betrayal. Did your father, when he came out, have anything to say to this Dr. Dennis Lee?
Yes, he had meeting with him.
Yes, he had meetings
He
with
tell
him.
us about it.
Yes.
And what's happened with the meeting?
He said, "Thank you, doctor, for your help." Something this way, and ironic, of course.
Of course. I mean, did Dr. Lee, was he just an idiot or what? I mean, you know, he helped get people imprisoned, you know.
You see, at the time, there was a concern of keeping relations with the former Soviet Union, and to keep this association of psychiatrists working. So there was a professional prerogative that unfortunately became criminal, because of this, Bukowski received a sentence of 12 years sitting in a psychiatric prison. Yeah.
Well, I would be very, very ashamed if I was Dr. Lee. That's all I can say. Senya, let me just ask you, if I may, just switch from the film. You moved just 3 months ago to Tbilisi in Georgia, though you're from Moscow, presumably because of the political situation in Russia at present.
Yes.
Are you pessimistic for Russia? I mean, if I may say, I'm sure you've heard of the philosopher's ship from 100 years ago in the time of Lenin, where Lenin, for people that don't know, Lenin was happy to have intellectuals leave the country because they were just bother and trouble for him. Maybe Putin too is happy to have people like you and your husband and tens of thousands of other Russian middle-class liberal intellectuals who are now moving to Tbilisi in Georgia or Tel Aviv or to Finland, Kazakhstan or Istanbul or wherever they're going.
Everywhere.
And Putin's quite happy.
It's a huge wave of
huge wave. Philosophers, massive arc, not just a ship. But are you pessimistic? Maybe in a way, this is what Putin wants, and he's happy to get rid of, you know, they're troublesome for him, all these liberal intellectuals.
Yes, I'm more pessimistic, I would say. We understand that they don't need us, people like me and my husband and others who are at the opposite side, and they do not. They let us to go out, and that is good. It's good that we can leave Russia, because we can't stay there anymore. Such atmosphere, all these, you know, banners with the Russian heroes from the war. It's very hard to see it, and I don't believe in that there will be some revolution in Russia and Russia became a democratic state. I don't think so.
I just want to say to finish off, because unfortunately we don't have more time, but I think that I've done a Google search. I'm very disappointed that more people haven't written in English about Victor's death. You know, there should be obituaries. There are no proper obituaries, and I'm going to tell journalist friends of mine, I'm going to write something myself too, that really there should be some proper articles about Victor in America and Britain or Canada or so on. At the moment, there's hardly anything, just one or two minor references. And also, Senya's film had its premiere that was very nice and very happy I went in the Cinematheque in Tel Aviv, where Senya's visiting Israel at the moment and where Sarah lives. And it was a very nice occasion. Other diplomats came. I'm glad the Czech and Slovak ambassadors to Israel came to pay their respects, because after all, he did for Czechoslovakia, not just for Russia, what Victor did. But I think that Senya's film and her husband's film, I hope it gets a proper showing on TV or at film festivals or indeed in movie theaters in the West. And I will put on this YouTube underneath it some details about the film for anybody who's more interested, and some other links. So thank you very much, and speak to you soon.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.